The screams began at midnight. Not the practiced wails of grief or calculated cries for attention, but raw, animalistic sounds that scraped against the ancient stones of Castle Hohenschatten like fingernails on slate. Prince Albrecht of Bavaria, once the pride of his dynasty, now crawled naked through his chambers, his fingernails torn and bleeding from clawing at the walls. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had once charmed the courts of Europe, now bulged with terror as he shrieked about shadows that moved without bodies, about faces in the mirrors that weren't his own. The servants found him that first morning of December 1864, huddled in a corner, covered in his own filth, whispering prayers to gods whose names no Christian should know. This was the reality of the mad Prince of Bavaria, the last heir to a 1,000-year bloodline, reduced to a gibbering wretch in a castle that had become his prison. But this wasn't how it started. Just 6 months earlier, Prince Albrecht had stood tall in the grand ballroom of Munich, his medals gleaming on his chest, his wit sharp enough to draw laughter from even the stern Prussian ambassadors. At 32, he was everything a Bavarian prince should be, educated at the finest universities, trained in military strategy, fluent in 5 languages, and possessed of that particular charm that made both men and women lean in when he spoke. The tragedy that would unfold in the winter months ahead seemed impossible then, as he danced with duchesses and debated philosophy with scholars. No one could have imagined that this golden prince would soon be found eating spiders in his bedchamber, claiming they whispered secrets about the kingdom's future. How did Prince Albrecht transform from Bavaria's most promising heir to a madman whose screams would echo through history? What drove a man of such intellect and breeding to tear out his own hair while babbling about mirrors that showed the truth beneath the skin? The answer lies buried in the frozen winter of 1864, in a castle where ancient secrets and modern ambitions collided with catastrophic results. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about madness, about nobility, and about the price some pay for knowledge they were never meant to possess. Castle Hohenschatten itself seemed to conspire in the prince's descent. Built in the 11th century on a crag overlooking the Bavarian Alps, it had served as both fortress and prison for the House of Wittelsbach's cadet branch. By 1864, Bavaria was caught between the old world and the new. The Industrial Revolution was transforming German states, Prussia was rising as a military power, and ancient noble families found their influence waning. Prince Albrecht's branch of the family had ruled their small principality for 800 years, but their coffers were empty, their lands mortgaged, and their political relevance questionable. The castle, once a symbol of power, had become a mausoleum of faded glory. Its great halls echoed with absence. Portraits of ancestors stared down at empty chairs, and the prince rattled around in rooms built for hundreds with only a skeleton staff of aging servants who remembered better days. The court physicians would later testify about the warning signs they had missed. The prince's obsession with the castle's history had intensified after his father's death in 1863. He spent days in the archives, poring over medieval texts and family records that hadn't been disturbed for centuries. Servants reported finding him in the castle's oldest tower, the one that had been sealed since the plague years, muttering about duties to the bloodline, and promises that must be kept. Then came the discovery that would seal his fate, a hidden chamber behind the castle's chapel, and within it an ornate mirror framed in black wood, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The prince had it moved to his private chambers despite the protests of Father Bernhard, the castle chaplain, who claimed the thing was unwholesome and stank of heresy. Little did anyone know that within weeks, Prince Albrecht would be found trying to claw his own eyes out, screaming that he had seen too much, that the mirror showed him what Bavaria would become, what we all would become. The worst was yet to come. As November turned to December, as the snows piled high against the castle walls and cut them off from the outside world, the prince's midnight screams would become a nightly ritual. Servants would find evidence of bizarre ceremonies, circles drawn in ash, candles arranged in patterns that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, and always that damned mirror positioned to reflect the moon's light into unholy angles. By the time the spring thaw came and investigators from Munich could finally reach the castle, they would find scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But that revelation awaits, buried beneath layers of horror that must first be peeled back, one screaming night at a time. Prince Albrecht Wilhelm Ferdinand von Wittelsbach was born on a storm-lashed night in October 1832, and the midwives later swore that lightning struck the castle's highest tower at the moment of his first cry. His mother, Princess Isabella of Saxony, died bringing him into the world, her final words a fevered ramble about the bloodline's burden, that the attending physician dismissed as birth delirium. His father, Prince Leopold, never quite looked at his son without a shadow crossing his face, as if the boy reminded him of something best forgotten. Still, Albrecht's early years showed nothing but promise. He walked before his first birthday, spoke in complete sentences by age 2, and by 5 could recite Latin prayers with the precision of a seminary student. Tutors marveled at his quick mind, though they occasionally noted a troubling intensity in how he studied certain subjects, particularly the genealogies and histories of noble bloodlines. The castle where he grew up was already showing signs of decay. The Hohenschatten branch of the Wittelsbachs had never been wealthy, even in their glory days, and by the 1840s, entire wings had been closed off to save on heating. Young Albrecht would explore these abandoned sections despite strict prohibitions, and servants would find him in conversation with empty air, claiming he was talking to the uncles, a peculiar habit given that his father had no brothers. When questioned, the boy would describe in detail relatives who had been dead for centuries, knowing things about them that weren't in any accessible family records. His father, already given to melancholy and drink, began avoiding his son altogether, leaving his education to a succession of increasingly nervous tutors. The first true crack in Albrecht's facade of normalcy came during his confirmation at age 13. As Bishop Gruber anointed him with holy oil, the boy suddenly ceased, his eyes rolling back to show only whites, and spoke in what the bishop later described as the voice of an old man, about sins that needed absolution and promises that bound beyond death. The fit lasted only moments, and young Albrecht claimed no memory of it, but Bishop Gruber left the castle that very day and never returned. Word of the incident was suppressed, but whispers spread among the household staff. Some of the older servants began making the sign against evil when the young prince passed, though they were careful to hide it from their masters. What allowed these early signs to be dismissed was the very isolation of Castle Hohenschatten. Perched high in the Alps, accessible only by a treacherous mountain road that became impassable for months during winter, the castle was its own world. Prince Leopold, drowning in debts and wine, had long since stopped receiving visitors from the greater nobility. The household had shrunk to a bare minimum, a handful of servants too old or too loyal to seek employment elsewhere, a single tutor who doubled as librarian, and Father Bernhard, a priest whose own reputation had been tainted by whispers of heterodox beliefs. In this echo chamber of decline, Albrecht's peculiarities were normalized. His midnight wanderings were attributed to scholarly dedication. His conversations with unseen presences were dismissed as the loneliness of an isolated child. His growing obsession with certain locked rooms and sealed archives was seen as natural curiosity about his heritage. The first victim of what would become Albrecht's madness was his tutor, Herr Dr. Wilhelm Faust. Yes, the irony of the name was not lost on anyone. Faust was a learned man who had studied at Heidelberg and Prague, drawn to the isolated castle by debts and disgrace involving accusations of unnatural philosophical inquiries. He found in young Albrecht an eager pupil for subjects that went far beyond the approved curriculum. Together they delved into medieval texts that the Church had condemned, astronomical treatises that suggested disturbing truths about the heavens, and, most dangerously, the private journals of Albrecht's ancestors. It was in these journals that they first encountered references to the obligation, a duty that each firstborn male of the line apparently owed, though the exact nature was never clearly stated. Faust grew increasingly agitated as their research progressed, and servants noticed him arguing with Albrecht, begging the young man to leave certain doors closed. On Christmas Eve of 1851, Faust was found dead in the library, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, clutching a page torn from a book that crumbled to ash when touched. But this was only the beginning. The servants noticed changes in their young master after Faust's death. Albrecht, now 19, had always been pale, but his skin took on an almost translucent quality. He began refusing to eat meat, claiming it screamed on his plate. Most disturbing were the sounds that came from his chambers at night, not quite prayers, not quite incantations, but something that seemed to make the very stones of the castle resonate in harmony. When Prince Leopold died in 1863, supposedly of a weak heart, the servants whispered that he had been found facing the wall of his chamber, his fingers bloody from scratching at the stones, having carved a single word over and over, heir. With his father dead, Prince Albrecht was now master of Hohenschatten, free to pursue whatever obsessions drove him. And in the autumn of 1864, those obsessions would lead him to unsealed chambers that had been closed since the Black Death, where certain items had been hidden by ancestors who knew their danger but couldn't bring themselves to destroy them. The mirror was waiting, as it had waited for centuries, for the heir who would finally be weak enough, or strong enough, to look into its depths and see what lay beneath Bavaria's noble facade. the mirror was only the beginning. As investigators would later piece together from servant testimonies and the prince's own fevered writings, what transpired in Castle Hohenschatten during the winter of 1864 was not mere madness but a systematic descent into self-inflicted tortures that defied comprehension. The prince's chambers became a workshop of agony, each implement carefully chosen, each method precisely calculated to achieve what he called purification through pain. The servants who survived that winter spoke of finding devices that seemed to have been constructed according to ancient specifications, not the crude instruments of medieval torture chambers, but elegant, almost artistic creations that suggested a deep understanding of human anatomy and the precise points where body and mind could be pushed to their absolute limits. The first device discovered was what the prince termed the crown of clarity. Fashioned from silver wire and thorns from a species of alpine rose that only grew in the castle's abandoned garden, this circlet was designed to be worn tight around the skull. The thorns, each precisely placed, would penetrate the scalp at specific points that Albrecht's journals indicated were the 7 gates of perception. When worn, the device created a pain so pure and focused that the prince claimed it allowed him to see through the veils. Servants found him wearing it for hours at a time, blood trickling down his face in crimson tears while he stared into that accursed mirror, laughing and weeping in equal measure. The truly disturbing detail was that the crown showed signs of adjustment and refinement. He had been perfecting it, making the pain more precise, more effective at achieving whatever visions he sought. Then there was the Chamber of Echoes, a modification he made to the castle's smallest tower room. Using principles he claimed to have found in his ancestors' journals, the prince had the room's walls covered in panels of polished metal, angled to create a specific acoustic effect. When he locked himself inside and began his screaming sessions, for they were sessions planned and deliberate, the sound would bounce and amplify, creating harmonics that seemed to penetrate not just the ears but the very bones. Servants reported that the screams from this chamber could be felt in the stones throughout the castle, a vibration that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. The prince would emerge from these sessions with blood running from his ears, speaking of frequencies that unlocked the ancestral memory, and sounds that existed before human speech. The most elaborate torture, however, was what the prince called the redemption of flesh. This involved a series of precisely timed exposures to extreme cold and heat. He would strip naked and stand on the castle's highest balcony during blizzards, allowing his skin to approach frostbite, then immediately plunge into near-boiling baths infused with herbs that increased skin sensitivity. The rapid alternation between freezing and scalding created a pain that he described in his journals as transformative. But this was combined with other elements. During the cold exposure, he would stare into arrangements of mirror shards that reflected the moon and stars in patterns based on astronomical calculations. During the heat, he would consume tinctures made from plants that grew in the castle's crypt, plants that Father Bernhard warned had been used in witch trials as truth serums. The combination of physical agony, visual stimulation, and chemical alteration created states of consciousness that the prince documented in increasingly incoherent scribblings. The psychology behind these self-tortures was rooted in what the prince believed was his family's hidden history. His research had convinced him that the Hohenschatten line carried what he called the sight, an ability to perceive truths about the kingdom's future, but only through suffering. Each torture method was designed to strip away what he termed the comfortable lies of flesh, and reveal deeper realities. In his more lucid writings, he explained that physical pain was merely a key, that the body's extremity could unlock perceptions normally hidden by the mind's protective mechanisms. He cited medieval mystics who used flagellation and fasting, but his methods went far beyond religious mortification. These were scientific experiments in consciousness, using the laboratory of his own flesh. The castle's inhabitants watched in growing horror as their master's experiments escalated. By January 1865, 3 servants had fled despite the winter storms, preferring to risk death in the mountains rather than remain in what one called a place where hell was being methodically constructed. Those who stayed reported finding evidence of even more disturbing practices. The prince had begun collecting his own blood in crystal vials, mixing it with various substances and using the compounds to paint symbols on the mirrors. He would fast for days, then consume only foods that induced hallucinations, certain mushrooms that grew in the castle's depths, bread made from ergot-contaminated rye, and wine mixed with substances that made the room spin and shadows dance. Combined with the physical tortures, these practices pushed his consciousness into realms that his writings could barely describe, though he tried desperately to document what he saw. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of what happened when the prince combined all his methods. On certain nights when astronomical conditions were correct, and his calculations for these times showed a mathematical precision that suggested his madness had not destroyed his intellect, he would engage in marathon sessions. The crown of thorns on his head, his body alternating between extreme temperatures, the chamber filled with those reality-bending echoes, and his consciousness altered by carefully prepared compounds. Servants who approached his chambers during these sessions reported that the very air seemed to thicken, that shadows moved independently of their sources, and that sometimes, just sometimes, they could swear they heard other voices joining the prince's screams, voices that seemed to come from the mirrors themselves. What Prince Albrecht was trying to achieve through these elaborate tortures remained unclear, but what was certain was that each session left him more changed, more removed from anything recognizable as human. Behind each device, each method, each precisely calculated agony, was a human being systematically destroying himself in pursuit of visions that would ultimately consume not just his body and mind, but perhaps his very soul. Before the madness claimed her, Anna Margret had been the pride of her family. At 19, the baker's daughter from the village below Castle Hohenschatten possessed a voice so pure that Father Bernhard had convinced her parents to let her join the castle staff, promising that the prince might sponsor her musical education. She arrived in September 1864, her eyes bright with dreams of singing in Munich's opera houses, her modest trunk packed with the few good dresses her mother had sewn. The other servants remembered her first day, how she had curtsied perfectly to Prince Albrecht, how he had paused mid-sentence when he heard her speaking voice, how his eyes had fixed on her with an intensity that made the housekeeper instinctively step between them. "She has the resonance," he had murmured, words that meant nothing then but would later echo in the nightmares of those who survived that winter. For the first month, Anna's life at the castle seemed blessed. The prince indeed arranged for music lessons, bringing in Herr Kaufmann from the valley to teach her proper technique. She was given a room in the servants' quarter with a view of the mountains, better accommodations than she had ever known. Her duties were light, serving at formal dinners that rarely happened, maintaining the music room that had stood silent for years. She wrote letters home filled with wonder at the castle's fading grandeur, the library's countless books, the kindness of the older servants who treated her like a granddaughter. But she also mentioned, almost in passing, the prince's peculiar interest in her voice. He would ask her to sing specific notes, to hold them while he observed with what she described as scientific attention, making notations in a leather journal. He spoke of frequencies and harmonics, of how certain voices could unlock doors that should remain closed. The torture began subtly. In October, the prince requested private performances, asking Anna to sing in different rooms of the castle to test the acoustics. These sessions grew longer and stranger. He would have her sing while standing in precise positions, sometimes for hours until her throat was raw. He introduced elements that seemed merely eccentric at first, having her sing while staring into mirrors, while holding certain objects, while standing barefoot on stone floors in increasingly cold rooms. When she complained of discomfort, he spoke passionately about the necessity of sacrifice for true art, about how the greatest singers understood that beauty came from pain. He gave her teas that he claimed would enhance her voice but made her feel disconnected from her body, as if she were floating above herself, watching her own performance from a great distance. By November, what had begun as eccentric training had transformed into deliberate torture. The prince had Anna sing in the Chamber of Echoes, where the acoustic effects made her own voice return to her as something alien and terrifying. He would lock her in the room for hours, demanding she maintain specific notes while the reverberations built to painful levels. Servants found her afterward with blood trickling from her ears, her hands clutched over them, whimpering about voices inside the sound. But the prince was relentless, speaking of breakthrough and transformation, of how she was so close to achieving the true resonance. He began combining her sessions with his own experiments, making her sing while he wore his crown of thorns, claiming her voice helped him see more clearly. The other servants tried to protect her, to limit her exposure to their increasingly deranged master, but Anna herself seemed caught in his web, unable to refuse, speaking of duties she didn't understand but felt compelled to fulfill. The night of December 13th marked the point of no return. The prince summoned Anna to his private chambers for what he called the great working. The servants who helped prepare her still wept when they recalled it, how they had been ordered to dress her in a white gown that belonged to the prince's long-dead mother, how her hands shook as they braided her hair with silver threads, how she whispered prayers and apologies to her parents. What exactly transpired in those chambers remained partly mystery, partly nightmare. The screaming began at midnight, not just the prince's familiar howls but Anna's voice, raised in notes that no human throat should produce. The sounds that emerged defied description. Harmonics that made the castle's stones vibrate, frequencies that caused mass hallucinations among the staff. Several servants reported seeing the walls themselves ripple like water, seeing faces form in the surfaces, ancient faces with eyes full of terrible knowledge. When the doors were finally opened at dawn, they found Anna alive but fundamentally changed. Her beautiful voice was gone, replaced by a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere far away and cold. She spoke in languages she had never learned, drew symbols she had never seen, and worst of all, she smiled, a constant, vacant smile as if she were privy to some cosmic joke. The prince declared the experiment a success, claiming he had opened her to the true frequencies, but even he seemed shaken by what had occurred. Anna wandered the castle for 3 more days, touching mirrors and whispering to reflections only she could see, before she simply vanished. A search found her footprints in the snow leading to the castle's highest tower, then nothing, as if she had simply stepped off into the winter sky. Her parents received a letter in her hand, though she couldn't have written it after that night, saying she had gone to sing with the choir that exists between the notes. This was just one of many who fell victim to the prince's madness. There was Klaus, the stable boy who was forced to stare into the mirror while the prince conducted experiments in perception, and who was later found trying to claw his own eyes out, screaming about the things that wear our faces. There was Greta, the chambermaid who was made to clean the prince's torture implements, who began speaking in rhymes and prophecies before throwing herself from the castle walls. Each victim was carefully chosen for what the prince perceived as special qualities, a particular sensitivity, a family history of visions, or simply the misfortune of being in the wrong place when his madness demanded new subjects. By the time the winter began to break, at least 7 servants had died, disappeared, or been driven irreversibly insane. But Anna's story remained the most haunting, perhaps because she had come to the castle with such hope, such dreams of a brighter future. Instead, she became a cautionary tale whispered in the villages below. When the mad nobles call for your children, sometimes it's better to refuse no matter the cost. The prince had turned her gift into a curse, her voice into a weapon against her own sanity, and in the end transformed a baker's daughter into something that wasn't quite human anymore. A victim not just of torture but of transformation into something that should not exist. The true scale of Prince Albrecht's descent into madness extended far beyond the castle walls, creating ripples of horror that would poison the entire region for generations. By February 1865, what had begun as the private obsession of one mad nobleman had infected the surrounding valleys like a plague of the mind. Official records, carefully suppressed by Bavarian authorities, documented at least 43 cases of contagious insanity in the villages below Hohenschatten. Peasants who had never set foot in the castle began reporting shared nightmares of mirrors reflecting scenes of future catastrophe. Children drew symbols they couldn't have known, symbols that matched perfectly the arcane designs found in the prince's chambers. The very landscape seemed to absorb the wrongness emanating from the castle. Livestock born with disturbing deformities, crops withering in patterns that formed the same recurring symbols, and always, the reports of singing heard on the wind, in voices that belonged to no living person. The systematic nature of the horror revealed itself through the prince's meticulous record-keeping. Investigators later discovered 17 journals filled with observations, calculations, and experiments that showed this was no random madness but a carefully orchestrated campaign to achieve something the prince called the Great Revelation. His writings detailed a cosmology of horror in which Bavaria, indeed all of the German states, were built upon foundations of blood and ancient pacts. According to his research, every noble family carried what he termed the debt, a spiritual obligation incurred by ancestors who had made bargains for power with entities better left unnamed. The mirrors were not mere tools but windows into what he called the true history, showing not the past as it was recorded but as it actually existed, a chronicle of atrocities, sacrifices, and inhuman bargains that underpinned European civilization itself. The prince had categorized his victims with the precision of a naturalist classifying specimens. There were the resonators, like poor Anna, individuals whose voices or presence could amplify certain frequencies. The seers were those with latent psychic sensitivities whom he subjected to tortures designed to open their third eye. The carriers were individuals he believed possessed bloodlines connected to ancient sins, whom he tortured to extract ancestral memories. Most disturbing were the innocents, children and young adults with no special qualities save their purity, whom he used as what he called control subjects, in experiments too horrible to fully document. Each category faced specific tortures tailored to their supposed abilities, all in service of the prince's grand design to tear open the veil between what is and what truly is. The infrastructure of suffering within Castle Hohenschatten had grown into something resembling a miniature kingdom of horror. The prince had converted entire wings into what could only be described as laboratories of torment. The old ballroom became a hall of mirrors, each reflecting surface treated with substances that caused hallucinations and disorientation. The wine cellars were transformed into isolation chambers where victims were kept in absolute darkness while being subjected to sounds, recorded screams, inhuman frequencies, and worst of all, recordings of their own voices twisted into unrecognizable forms. The castle's ancient heating system was modified to pump various gases and vapors throughout different sections, creating atmospheres that altered consciousness and made reality itself seem negotiable. Even the gardens were conscripted into this architecture of madness, with certain plants cultivated for their psychoactive properties and arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But who were the people behind this machine of torture? The prince, in his madness, had not acted entirely alone. He had gathered around him a small coterie of the damned, individuals drawn by curiosity, greed, or their own fractures of sanity. There was Dr. Hieronymus Kraft, a disgraced physician from Vienna who had been expelled from the medical establishment for unconscionable experiments. Kraft saw in the prince's work an opportunity to explore theories about consciousness and pain that no ethical institution would permit. There was the mysterious woman known only as the Countess, who claimed to be from an extinct Bohemian noble line and who provided the prince with texts and artifacts that even he found disturbing. She seemed to encourage his worst impulses, whispering of greater revelations that lay just beyond the next threshold of horror. Most tragic was Father Bernhard himself, the castle chaplain who had started as a voice of reason but gradually became complicit, convincing himself that the prince's work was a form of divine revelation, a necessary harrowing before some cosmic truth could emerge. The collaboration between these individuals created a synergy of horror that amplified each person's capacity for cruelty. Kraft provided medical knowledge that made the tortures more effective while keeping victims alive far longer than should have been possible. The Countess contributed occult knowledge and artifacts that gave the experiments a supernatural dimension. Father Bernhard provided theological justifications, twisting scripture to support the idea that suffering was a gateway to enlightenment. Together, they formed a council of horror that met nightly in the prince's study, planning new experiments, reviewing results, and pushing each other toward ever greater extremities. Servants who survived reported overhearing these meetings, describing an atmosphere of scholarly excitement as the conspirators discussed human suffering with the same detachment as botanists examining specimens. The economic dimension of this horror network revealed another layer of complicity. The prince's experiments required resources, rare books, chemical compounds, specialized equipment, and silence from local authorities. A shadow economy emerged, centered on Castle Hohenschatten. Merchants in Munich and Prague received orders for unusual items, paid for with gold coins bearing faces that numismatists couldn't identify. Local officials were bribed to ignore the disappearances, the strange lights seen from the castle, the way even hardened mountaineers refused to take the road past Hohenschatten after dark. The prince's remaining wealth, inherited from centuries of noble privilege, was systematically converted into the currency of horror. By the end, investigators estimated that over 100,000 gulden had been spent on what the prince called his great work, enough to feed a village for decades, instead used to perfect the machinery of madness. Prince Albrecht Wilhelm Ferdinand von Wittelsbach was, by all accounts, brilliant even in his madness. Those who knew him before the winter of 1864 described a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts coupled with a sensitivity that bordered on the supernatural. He could speak 7 languages fluently, had memorized vast passages of classical literature, and possessed an understanding of mathematics and astronomy that impressed university professors. But beneath this glittering surface lay fractures that ran back generations. His grandmother, Princess Elisabetha, had died in an asylum, speaking of doors in the blood that must not open. His great-uncle Wolfgang had sealed himself in a monastery after claiming to have visions of Bavaria drowning in shadows. The madness that consumed Albrecht was not an aberration but a culmination, as if centuries of breeding among European nobility had concentrated not just power and wealth but also a terrible sensitivity to realities better left unperceived. The prince's descent was accelerated by personal tragedies that stripped away his psychological defenses. His wife, Maria Theresa of Saxe-Coburg, had died in childbirth 3 years before, taking with her their stillborn son, a child born with deformities that the midwife refused to describe before burning the body. The prince had been present at the birth, and servants reported he emerged from the chamber changed, speaking of the old blood showing itself, and debts coming due. He never remarried, instead throwing himself into scholarly pursuits that grew increasingly esoteric. Letters to academic colleagues from this period show a mind grappling with concepts that strained the boundaries of 19th-century thought, questions about consciousness, heredity, and what he called the archaeology of sin. One professor at Heidelberg wrote back begging him to cease these inquiries before they cease you. Dr. Hieronymus Kraft represented a different species of monster, the rational mind bent to irrational purposes. At 53, he had once been Vienna's most promising neurologist, published in journals across Europe for his work on the nervous system. But his fascination with pain's relationship to consciousness had led him down dark paths. Expelled from the medical establishment for conducting surgeries without anesthesia to study pure neural response, he had wandered Europe's margins, offering his services to anyone who would fund his research. In Prince Albrecht he found the perfect patron, unlimited resources, aristocratic protection, and a shared obsession with consciousness's extremities. Kraft's journals, discovered after the horror's end, revealed a mind that had replaced empathy with curiosity. He wrote clinical observations of torture sessions with the same detachment as botanical studies, noting how Subject 7 screams achieved a remarkable purity at the third hour, or how the application of heated copper to nerve clusters produced fascinating chromatic hallucinations. The woman known as the Countess remains the most enigmatic figure in this constellation of horror. She appeared at Castle Hohenschatten in November 1864, claiming to be Countess Lucretia Bathory Czerny, last of a line that supposedly traced back to the infamous Blood Countess. No records confirmed her identity, but she possessed knowledge and artifacts that proved her connections to Europe's occult underground. Described by survivors as beautiful in a way that made observers uneasy, too perfect, too still, as if she were a porcelain doll animated by some unholy will, she became the prince's closest confidant and possibly his lover. She provided him with books bound in unusual leather, mirrors made from volcanic glass that reflected scenes wrongly, and most disturbingly what she called ancestral resonances, objects that had absorbed the suffering of centuries. Her motivations remained opaque. Unlike Kraft's scientific curiosity or the prince's desperate seeking, the Countess seemed to pursue horror for its own sake, as if suffering were an art form she was helping to perfect. Father Benhardt's transformation from spiritual guardian to accomplice in atrocity represented perhaps the most tragic fall. At 61 he had served the castle for 30 years, baptizing, marrying, and burying 3 generations of the family. His early opposition to the prince's experiments had been fierce. He had tried to destroy the mirror, had pleaded with authorities to intervene, had even attempted an exorcism. But something in what he witnessed broke his faith, or perhaps transformed it. By December he was providing theological frameworks for the tortures, speaking of mortification of the flesh as gateway to divine truth, and the necessity of harrowing hell before achieving heaven. His sermons, delivered to the dwindling castle staff, became increasingly unhinged, mixing Christian doctrine with references to older, darker traditions. He began conducting ceremonies that bore no resemblance to Catholic Mass, using languages that predated Latin, invoking names that made even the prince uncomfortable. The recruitment and training of others into this system of horror followed patterns that would become familiar to students of 20th-century atrocities. The prince and his inner circle didn't simply command, they seduced, corrupted, and compromised. Young servants were initially asked to perform small transgressions, delivering messages, preparing harmless-seeming compounds, standing guard during private ceremonies. Each complicit act made the next easier, each crossing of moral boundaries made returning impossible. Hans Müller, a footman who later testified at the inquiry, described how he went from reluctantly assisting to actively participating. First it was just holding them down. Then it was selecting who would be next. By the end I was suggesting new methods. God help me, I was proud when the prince praised my creativity. The castle became a closed system where normal morality inverted, where causing suffering became craft, where screams became music. The bureaucracy of horror that emerged was perhaps most chilling in its banality. Schedules were drawn up for torture sessions. Supplies were ordered with the same efficiency as dinner parties. There were staff meetings to discuss the week's experiments, complete with progress reports and plans for improvement. The Countess maintained correspondence with similar groups across Europe, trading techniques and comparing results. Dr. Kraft compiled statistics on pain tolerance across different demographics. Father Bernhardt kept detailed spiritual records of each session, noting which prayers produced the most dramatic effects. Even in their madness, they maintained the forms and procedures of civilized life, as if systematic record-keeping could somehow legitimize the unspeakable. This normalization of atrocity, this reduction of human agony to administrative routine, would prove to be one of the most disturbing aspects of the Hohenstaufen horror when finally exposed to the world. The horror at Castle Hohenstaufen did not exist in isolation. It festered within a society that, through action and inaction, allowed it to flourish. Bavaria in 1864 was a kingdom caught between medieval traditions and modern upheavals, where ancient noble privileges still held sway over law and justice. The local magistrate, Herr Gottfried Steinbach, later admitted to receiving multiple reports about disturbances at the castle but chose to file them away unread. "One does not simply investigate a Wittelsbach," he testified at the eventual inquiry, his hands shaking as he spoke. "Their family has ruled these lands since before memory. Who was I, a merchant's son with a purchased position, to question what occurred within those walls?" This deference to aristocratic authority created a protective shield around the prince's activities, allowing horrors to multiply while officials deliberately looked away. The Catholic Church's complicity ran deeper than Father Bernhard's individual corruption. Bishop Gruber, who had fled after young Albrecht's disturbing confirmation, had written urgent letters to Munich warning of spiritual irregularities at Hohenstaufen. These warnings were buried in ecclesiastical bureaucracy, dismissed as the overwrought concerns of a provincial bishop. The regional church hierarchy had financial entanglements with the noble families, tithes, land grants, and centuries of patronage created a web of obligation that made confronting aristocratic excess nearly impossible. Moreover, certain elements within the Bavarian church harbored their own esoteric interests. A secret society known as the Order of Sacred Shadows, composed of priests who studied divine mysteries through mortification, saw the prince's experiments as potentially revealing higher truths. They provided theological cover, arguing that if God permitted such suffering, it must serve a divine purpose beyond human understanding. The economic ecosystem surrounding the castle's horrors revealed capitalism's darkest face. Merchants who asked no questions about unusual orders profited handsomely. Johann Krebs, who supplied chemical compounds, saw his business triple during the winter of 1864-65. He later claimed ignorance of their purpose, though his own records showed notations like, "for the prince's special work," and "to be delivered after midnight only." The local mining company provided rare minerals without questioning why a castle would need compounds typically used in metallurgy. Even more damning was the human trafficking that fed the prince's experiments. Labor contractors who supplied servants to noble houses began targeting specific types: young women with musical talents, men with histories of second sight, orphans who wouldn't be missed. They received premium payments for individuals matching the prince's specifications, creating a market in human misery. The silence of the surrounding communities wasn't merely fear, it was purchased. The prince distributed gold liberally to ensure cooperation. Village mayors received mysterious donations for public works. The families of disappeared servants found bags of coins on their doorsteps with notes suggesting they seek employment elsewhere for their missing relatives. This blood money created a conspiracy of silence where entire communities became complicit through their acceptance of payment. The village of Unterbach, closest to the castle, saw its church rebuilt, its wells deepened, its poor fed through anonymous benefactors everyone knew originated from Hohenstaufen. The price was simple: hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing. When screams echoed across the valley on still nights, shutters closed and prayers were said louder. The intellectual class bore its own burden of guilt. The prince corresponded with scholars across Europe, sharing theories that should have triggered alarm. Professor Ernst Vogel at Munich University received detailed letters about experiments in consciousness that clearly described torture, yet he responded with academic interest rather than moral outrage. The Royal Bavarian Academy of Sciences filed the prince's submissions on hereditary memory and induced revelation, without comment, treating documentation of atrocity as legitimate research. This academic legitimacy emboldened the prince, convincing him that his work had scientific merit. A network of dilettante scholars, occultists masquerading as scientists, and scientists venturing into occultism provided theoretical frameworks that transformed sadism into scholarship. They never wielded the implements of torture, but their letters of encouragement and requests for further data made them architects of agony. The role of women in enabling the horror presents a particularly complex moral landscape. While the Countess was an active participant, other women in the noble social circle played subtler but crucial roles. The Duchess of Regensburg, the prince's cousin, received letters from concerned servants but dismissed them as lower-class hysteria. She continued to send her annual Christmas gifts to the castle, maintaining the fiction of normalcy that helped shield the prince from scrutiny. Noble wives who heard whispers at social gatherings chose gossip over action, treating the horror as scandalous entertainment rather than a crisis requiring intervention. Most tragically, some mothers in the valley, desperate for the gold that came with sending their children to serve at the castle, convinced themselves that the rumors were exaggerated. They prepared their daughters for service with tears and prayers but ultimately prioritized economic survival over their children's safety. Authorities' failure ran from the lowest village constable to the highest reaches of Bavarian government. King Ludwig II, himself struggling with mental peculiarities that would later define his reign, received at least 3 reports about his cousin's activities. He chose to treat them as family embarrassments rather than crimes, ordering a policy of discreet observation that in practice meant willful ignorance. The Ministry of Interior had a file on Hohenschatten that grew thick with unread reports. When pressure finally forced action, they sent an investigator who was turned away at the castle gates and simply reported that the prince was indisposed and maintaining appropriate noble solitude. This investigator, Heinrich Müller, later admitted to being relieved at being refused entry, having heard enough rumors to fear what he might find inside. The state apparatus that should have protected the vulnerable instead protected the powerful, creating a framework where noble madness could flourish unchecked until it reached proportions too horrific to ignore. The beginning of the end came not through official intervention but through the courage of a kitchen maid named Margaret Braun. On the night of March 15, 1865, as another session of horrors unfolded in the castle's upper chambers, she made a decision that would finally shatter the conspiracy of silence. Having witnessed the transformation of her friend Anna and the disappearance of too many others, Margaret stole the prince's seal and a collection of his most damning journals. She fled through the servants' passages she had memorized over years of service, out through the ancient siege tunnels that connected to the valley below. The flight nearly killed her. Pursued by the prince's groundskeepers through a blizzard, she arrived at the monastery of St. Bartholomew more dead than alive, her fingers blackened with frostbite, clutching the evidence that would finally force action. The monks who received her initially wanted to return her to the castle, fearing aristocratic retribution. But Brother Thomas, the youngest of the order, read portions of the prince's journals and was so horrified that he defied his abbot. He made copies of key passages and sent them not to the compromised local authorities but to newspapers in Munich and Vienna. The journalists who received these packages initially dismissed them as sensationalist fiction, but the detail, the aristocratic seal, and Margaret's desperate testimony convinced editor Wilhelm Roth of the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten to investigate. His decision to publish excerpts on March 20, 1865, under the headline Unspeakable Horrors in Noble House, would prove to be the crack that brought down the entire edifice of protection around Castle Hohenschatten. Public reaction was immediate and volcanic. The excerpts Roth published, carefully edited to avoid the most extreme content, still contained enough horror to shock a society that prided itself on civilized progress. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices demanding more information. The story spread across German-speaking lands like wildfire, picked up by papers in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. What made it impossible to suppress was the evidence's specificity, names, dates, detailed descriptions that could be verified. Other servants from the castle, emboldened by Margaret's example, began coming forward with their own testimonies. The dam of silence, once broken, released a flood of accusations that grew more horrific with each revelation. Internal conflicts among the perpetrators accelerated the collapse. Dr. Kraft, sensing the changing wind, attempted to flee with his research materials but was intercepted by the Countess's men, for she had her own network of servants. Their confrontation in the castle's great hall was witnessed by several servants who reported that Kraft accused the Countess of using them all for purposes they didn't understand, while she laughed and called him a small man who thought he was touching greatness but was merely a tool. Father Bernhard, his mind finally breaking under the weight of his complicity, locked himself in the castle chapel and began a marathon confession, speaking to God and anyone who would listen about the horrors he had enabled. His ravings, audible throughout the castle, included details that even the prince had tried to keep hidden. The careful hierarchy of horror began to devour itself. External pressure mounted from unexpected quarters. The Prussian government, looking for ways to embarrass Bavaria, used diplomatic channels to demand a formal investigation. The Vatican, horrified by reports of a corrupted priest, sent its own investigators. Most surprisingly, Queen Victoria of England, who had familial connections to various German noble houses, privately communicated her deepest concern about reports reaching London. The international attention made it impossible for Bavarian authorities to maintain their policy of willful ignorance. King Ludwig II, facing the possibility of international scandal that could weaken Bavaria's position in the growing German unification movement, finally authorized a formal investigation led by someone outside the local power structure. Prosecutor Klaus von Hartmann from Berlin, known for his incorruptibility and his disdain for aristocratic privilege. The final push came from within the castle itself. On March 25, 1865, as news of the impending investigation reached Hohenstatten, Prince Albrecht made what witnesses described as his last gambit. He announced to his remaining followers that the time had come for the great revelation, that all their work had led to this moment. He ordered all mirrors brought to the Great Hall, arranged in a pattern that he claimed would open the final door. But his followers were fracturing. Dr. Kraft was dead, found in his chambers with his throat cut, whether by his own hand or another's remained unclear. The Countess had vanished, leaving only a note in a language no one could identify. Father Bernhard was mad, conducting services for invisible congregations. Of the servants, only a handful of the most broken remained. As the prince began his final ritual, even these last supporters felt the wrongness of what was happening. The very air in the castle seemed to rebel against what he was attempting. The arrival of von Hartmann's investigation team on March 27 found a scene that defied rational description. The castle's great hall had become a maze of mirrors reflecting impossibilities, angles that hurt the eyes, reflections that showed rooms that didn't exist, and in the center, Prince Albrecht himself, aged decades and days, his hair white, his eyes reflecting depths that seemed to go on forever. He was speaking, but the words made no sense, mixing languages living and dead, making pronouncements about futures that hadn't happened, weeping for kingdoms that never existed. When they tried to restrain him, he began screaming in that voice the servants knew too well, but now it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the mirrors themselves, from the stones of the castle, from the air. It took 6 men to subdue him, and even then witnesses swore they could still hear the screaming after he had been gagged, as if the castle itself had learned his voice and continued the chorus. The immediate aftermath of the investigation's arrival at Castle Hohenstatten was chaos incarnate. Prosecutor von Hartmann's team, hardened investigators who had seen the worst of human nature, were unprepared for what they found. Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss, the first to enter the torture chambers, emerged vomiting and weeping, unable to speak coherently for hours. The systematic documentation of the horrors took 3 weeks, with investigators working in shifts because no one could endure more than a few hours in those rooms. They found not just instruments of torture but their results, preserved specimens that Dr. Kraft had kept, recordings of screams etched onto wax cylinders by some infernal mechanism, and worst of all, the mirrors. 7 investigators reported suffering lasting psychological damage from looking into those mirrors, claiming they saw visions of what humanity could become, futures that must never be allowed to unfold. The public revelation of the full extent of the horrors created a crisis that shook Bavaria to its foundations. Von Hartmann's report, published in redacted form because the complete version was deemed incompatible with public sanity, still contained enough detail to horrify a continent. The illustrations drawn by police artists, sanitized versions of what they witnessed, caused riots in Munich when displayed. Churches held special services of purification. Universities conducted emergency symposiums on the nature of evil. The very concept of aristocratic immunity came under assault as crowds demanded justice not just for Prince Albrecht but for all who had enabled him. The socialist newspapers seized on the scandal as proof of noble corruption, while conservative forces scrambled to contain what they feared could spark revolution. The trials that followed were themselves a form of theater that struggled to contain the supernatural horror within legal frameworks. Prince Albrecht, confined in a specially constructed cell with no reflective surfaces, alternated between catatonic silence and prophetic ravings. When he did speak coherently, his testimony chilled the courtroom. He spoke of visions of a future Europe drowned in mechanized slaughter, of weapons that could burn entire cities, of horrors that would make his torture seem quaint. The prosecution struggled to maintain focus on his actual crimes when his predictions carried such terrible conviction. The Countess had vanished entirely, though investigators following her trail found a network of similar horrors across Europe. Noble houses with hidden chambers, mysterious disappearances and always mirrors that reflected wrongly. The surviving perpetrators faced justice in varying degrees. Father Bernhard, deemed insane, was confined to an asylum where he spent his remaining days conducting masses for invisible congregations and weeping for sins he could no longer articulate. The servants who had actively participated faced criminal trials that revealed the banality of evil, ordinary people who had chosen complicity over conscience. Hans Müller, the footman who had progressed from reluctant assistant to eager participant, was sentenced to 20 years hard labor. During his trial, he wept and spoke of how each small compromise had led to the next, how the castle had seemed to exist in a different world where normal morality didn't apply. His testimony became a crucial document in understanding how ordinary people become monsters. The survivors, those who had endured the prince's tortures and lived, faced a different kind of trial. Anna Margaret was found 3 months after her disappearance, living in a shepherd's hut high in the mountains. She had no memory of how she got there and could no longer speak except in songs that made listeners uneasy. The church declared her possessed and attempted exorcism, but the rituals only seemed to agitate whatever had taken residence within her. She spent her remaining years in a convent, where the nuns reported that on certain nights, her singing would harmonize with voices that had no source. Other survivors fared worse. Suicide rates among former castle servants reached epidemic proportions. Those who lived often reported shared nightmares, visions of the castle as it truly was, a nexus of realities where past and future collapsed into an eternal present of suffering. The physical evidence presented its own challenges. The torture devices were ordered destroyed, but workers reported that some implements resisted all attempts at destruction. The crown of thorns would reassemble itself no matter how thoroughly it was dismantled. Certain mirrors, when shattered, revealed smaller mirrors within each fragment, recursively reflecting scenes that drove viewers mad. The decision was made to seal these items in lead-lined vaults beneath the Frauenkirche in Munich, where they remain to this day, guarded by a secret order of priests who ensure they never again see light. The castle itself was marked for demolition, but when workers began the task, they reported such severe phenomena, tools aging decades in minutes, walls bleeding substances that defied analysis, spaces that existed in some rooms but not others, that the project was abandoned. Instead, the castle was sealed, its entrances bricked up, its road allowed to crumble, its very existence gradually erased from maps. Attempts to cover up or minimize what had occurred began almost immediately. The Bavarian government, fearing the scandal would weaken the monarchy, launched a campaign to discredit witnesses and suppress evidence. Official histories written in subsequent decades reduced the events to a footnote about aristocratic excess and the madness of Prince Albrecht. Key documents disappeared from archives. Witnesses died in statistically improbable accidents. The newspaper editor Wilhelm Roth, who had broken the story, found his offices burned and his presses destroyed by unknown vandals. He rebuilt and continued publishing until his mysterious death in 1867, found in his locked study with an expression of absolute terror and a mirror that no one remembered him owning. The systematic suppression was so effective that within a generation, the horrors of Hohenschatten had been reduced to local legend, whispered about but never fully believed. But the true legacy was more insidious than any cover-up could contain. In the years following the scandal, Bavaria and indeed much of Europe experienced what historians carefully termed social disturbances, but which bore unsettling resemblances to the phenomena at Hohenschatten. Increases in insanity, particularly among the nobility. Reports of mirrors reflecting false images. Children born with memories of events they couldn't have witnessed. Most disturbing were the copycat incidents. Minor nobles attempting to recreate the prince's experiments, convinced they could succeed where he had failed. A secret society calling itself the Order of the True Reflection emerged, dedicated to completing the great work. Though officially suppressed, evidence suggests they continued operating into the 20th century. Some historians, writing in private correspondence never meant for publication, suggested connections between Hohenschatten and later European horrors, that the prince had indeed seen the future and in seeing it, had somehow made it more likely to occur. The castle had been sealed, the immediate perpetrators punished, but the ideas, the possibilities, the cracks in reality that Prince Albrecht had created could not be so easily contained. The legacy of Castle Hohenschatten extends far beyond the immediate horror of 1864–65, casting shadows that reach into our present day. In 1923, a young Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler visited the ruins during his time in Munich, later writing in a private letter that he experienced visions of Germany's destiny, while standing before the sealed gates. Heinrich Himmler's SS Ahnenerbe included a secret division dedicated to studying the Hohenschatten phenomenon, believing Prince Albrecht had discovered ancient Aryan mystical practices. Documents recovered after World War II revealed that Nazi researchers attempted to locate and unseal the vaulted artifacts, convinced they contained keys to racial memory and consciousness manipulation. The parallels between the prince's systematic approach to horror and the mechanized atrocities of the Holocaust disturbed post-war investigators, particularly the shared obsession with documentation, the pseudoscientific justification of torture, and the belief that suffering could reveal higher truths. The lessons that should have been learned from Hohenschatten were repeatedly ignored throughout history. The prince's methods, the gradual normalization of cruelty, the scientific veneer applied to sadism, the exploitation of social deference to authority, appeared again and again in different contexts. Stalin's show trials employed similar psychological tortures designed to break not just the body but the sense of reality. The CIA's MKUltra program, with its experiments in consciousness alteration through trauma, bore unsettling resemblances to Dr. Kraft's research. Declassified documents from 1973 revealed that American intelligence services had studied the Bavarian incident as part of their research into enhanced interrogation techniques. The prince's insight that extreme states could alter consciousness became a cornerstone of modern psychological warfare, stripped of its occult trappings but retaining its essential cruelty. Modern archaeological and technological advances have revealed disturbing new dimensions to the Hohenschatten horror. In 2008, ground-penetrating radar studies of the castle grounds discovered a network of chambers extending far deeper than any historical records indicated. These spaces, still sealed, showed architectural anomalies that defied conventional engineering understanding. Thermal imaging revealed temperature variations that formed patterns matching the symbols found in the prince's journals. Most unsettling, acoustic analysis detected subsonic frequencies emanating from within the castle, frequencies that matched exactly the resonances Prince Albrecht had documented in his experiments with human voices. A team from the Technical University of Munich attempted to investigate in 2011 but abandoned the project after 3 researchers suffered what were officially described as severe psychological incidents, but which witnesses said involved the researchers speaking in languages they didn't know and drawing symbols they couldn't have seen. The digital age has brought new revelations and new dangers. In 2019, a cache of documents was discovered in the Vatican secret archives that included correspondence between church officials about Hohenschatten that had been misfiled for over a century. These letters revealed that similar incidents had occurred at noble houses across Europe in the same period, suggesting Prince Albrecht was part of a larger network of aristocratic occultists. More troubling, dark web forums dedicated to consciousness expansion through extreme experience have shown increasing interest in the Hohenschatten methods. In 2021, German authorities broke up a cell in Berlin that had been attempting to recreate the prince's mirror experiments, using modern materials and psychological techniques derived from his journals. The participants, mostly disaffected young intellectuals, spoke of seeking authentic experience in an age of simulation, showing how the prince's delusions could find new expression in contemporary alienation. The warning signs for today are impossible to ignore. The same social conditions that allowed Hohenschatten to occur, extreme inequality, deference to authority, the worship of hereditary privilege, the confusion of cruelty with strength, are resurging across the developed world. Modern technology has created new possibilities for the kind of systematic horror the prince pioneered. Deep fakes and virtual reality could create mirrors more powerful than anything Prince Albrecht imagined. Social media algorithms that trap people in echo chambers of their own fears and hatreds replicate the psychological isolation of the castle. The prince's vision of using suffering to reveal hidden truths finds new expression in extremist ideologies that valorize violence as authenticity. Most disturbing, the same intellectual frameworks that justified the horrors, the reduction of human consciousness to mechanism, the belief that extreme states reveal truth, the fascination with transgression as transcendence, have found new academic respectability in certain corners of neuroscience and philosophy. Recent incidents suggest the influence of Hohenschatten continues to manifest. In 2020, a tech billionaire's private compound in Switzerland was found to contain a room lined with smart mirrors programmed with algorithms based on patterns found in the prince's notes. The billionaire, who had spent millions acquiring Hohenschatten artifacts on the black market, was found in a catatonic state, endlessly drawing symbols that matched those in 150-year-old documents. In 2022, a prestigious German psychiatric hospital reported a cluster of patients suffering from what they termed Hohenschatten syndrome. Individuals with no connection to each other experiencing shared delusions about mirrors showing alternate realities, about voices teaching them the old songs, about a castle that calls to them in dreams. Most had never heard of the historical events, Yet their descriptions match details never made public. The human capacity for both cruelty and courage remains the central lesson of Hohenschattan. For every Prince Albrecht, there was a Margaret Braun who risked everything to expose the truth. For every Dr. Kraft, there were investigators who faced madness to document horror so it could never be denied. The castle still stands, sealed but not forgotten, a monument to what happens when brilliant minds turn to darkness, when society's guardians become its predators, when the pursuit of transcendence becomes an excuse for torture. As we face new technologies that could amplify human consciousness or shatter it, as we see rising authoritarianism and the glorification of cruelty, as we witness the return of mysticism dressed in scientific clothes, the Mad Prince's legacy demands we remember. The mirrors that show us uncomfortable truths about ourselves are not the enemy. The enemy is those who would use our discomfort to lead us into darkness, promising revelation through suffering, transcendence through cruelty, truth through torture. The final truth of Castle Hohenschattan is both simpler and more terrible than any supernatural explanation. Human beings, given power and permission, are capable of horrors that exceed any fiction. Prince Albrecht believed he was opening doors to hidden realities, but he only revealed the abyss that exists within human nature when all moral restraints are removed. His screams echo still, not through any supernatural persistence but through the very real consequences of his actions. The generational trauma, the ideas released into the world, the demonstration that even the most civilized society is only a few decisions away from barbarity. The castle remains sealed not because of what might escape but because of what it represents. A warning written in stone and suffering about the price of forgetting that every human being contains the capacity for both transcendence and monstrosity. Which potential we realize depends on the choices we make, the authorities we question, the suffering we refuse to normalize, and the mirrors we choose to look into. In the end, Prince Albrecht's greatest horror was not what he revealed about hidden realities but what he revealed about ourselves, and that revelation haunts us still.